It is Sean Gibbons from the Communications Network. It's lovely to see you on this Tuesday afternoon, at least here on the East Coast of the United States. We are going to kick things off as folks are coming into the room. I'm just going to give you a couple quick updates, and we're going to pass things over to Melissa. You're here, chances are, because you want to have a conversation about climate change and communications. And really, we're going to focus on how we need to be thinking about that, regardless of the issues that our foundations or nonprofits might be focused on. But we're going to start things by just saying hello to one another, because part of being in communications work is being in community, at least here at the network. So we're going to start with this idea that we've borrowed from Professor Brene Brown down at the University of Houston, and that's this two-word check-in. So if you would, Jade's already here. Hey, bud. And Diane and Cameron, y'all are getting in front of me. Oh, we got a Canadian here. You're psyched because Melissa's a Canadian. Name, location, and then 2 words. How are you? How you doing? So let's see. Okay, folks are already jumping. I was going to model it for you, but I'll just hop into the thing. Let's say hello to everybody. Lauren, Monique, Caitlin, Emily, Lena, Colleen, Reese, okay, going way too. Hey, Jack, how are you? Keith, okay, going way too fast for me. Suffice to say, chances are you're going to see a couple names that you know probably by now from us all living in that Zoom world. You know, you can say hello to one another directly, and we can certainly chit chat, ask questions of one another. And then across the way in this chat, we're going to be tossing in links if they're helpful to you. So with that, my partner in crime, Kareem Alston, is running the deck. Kareem, if you would, hey, Sarah, hey, Sam, hey, Megan, if you would go ahead and take us over to the next slide. This is something I'm going to try to do this super fast, gang, because we want to get to the good stuff. This is something I hope you know. We launched this. Kareem's been in the lab pulling things together, but we launched a new Slack for everybody in the network to be in touch with one another pretty much every time, always, right? So if you have a question, you want to share something you're working on, you're looking for an extra set of eyes, a little bit of feedback maybe, that's what Slack's aiming to do. It's only available to network members, but you can check it out at comnetwork.org. And Tristan just tossed a link into the chat to help you navigate there if you need to. All right, with that, let's move over to the next slide. This is the other thing. We just announced this. Maybe you saw this in your inbox. If not, it'll be there later, or you can go to ComNet 23 to find it. We've just opened our call for proposals for ComNet 23. That's going to be happening in the back end of September down in Atlanta, Georgia. And we need your help, as we always do. We build the conference with you and for you. So we are hopeful to have a whole bunch of folks who've got something extraordinary that they've learned over the course of the last little while, and that you might be generous and kind enough, as everyone always is, to share it with everybody else so we can all grow and get better. So that's that. Look in your inbox, or again, comnet23.org to sign in for proposals. Deadline for that is March the 31st. You got a little bit over 6 weeks to pull something together. Thanks so much for that. Now, moving ahead, if we could, very, very briefly, hopefully many of you know about this. We were delighted in Seattle to see a number of folks who've been involved in Circles. This is a new program, pretty easy kind of conceit behind this. It's good to know one another. And the best way to do that is to regularly check in. And so we do organize these things around the job that you do, so the role you may play in your organization, the issues maybe you're working on, or perhaps an identity you share. But we've been really thrilled to see this. It's sort of our way of shrinking the network and creating those kitchen cabinets that we all need to navigate our lives and our working lives. So hope you take advantage of that. That's available also to network members. Okay, moving right along. Next slide. ComNetwork Local is the other thing. This is open to everybody. Leadership is typically network members, but everybody is welcome. And as you can see from these little dots on the map, all around the country, we have local groups gathering. And the conceit behind this, again, pretty simple and clear. It's a good idea to get to know your neighbors, because sometimes, you know, you need to borrow a cup of sugar, or somebody just around the way knows something that you don't, that you're going to need on that given day. So locals are a great way to plug in. And again, those are free and open to all. And you can find more information in the chat or there on comnetwork.org. All right, I think one more slide over. Our friends in Detroit, maybe you remember this. They were supposed to gather last week. There was a big old storm that rolled through the Midwest. They decided to push back in favor of safety. So they're going to be gathering on the 9th, which is 2 days from now. So join our friends down in Detroit, a great group of folks. I know Jack's here in the chat. If you have any questions, maybe you can ask him directly. And of course, we're always happy to help. All right, I believe that's our last slide, and it's some time for me to make way. Before I do so, just want to say thanks to Kenya. She's with us, and she is providing ASL services. So chances are you see her up in the box there. She's always good because she keeps up with me. but suffice to say, we are grateful to have her help. And if you have need, we've also got closed captioning set up. You probably know that. Simply click on the CC. It actually does a pretty good job of giving an accurate account of what folks are saying. But between those two things, part of our commitment to accessibility. All right, with that, I'm going to get out of the way, and our friend Melissa is going to join us for what is the first of what is going to be 2 webinars where we're going to talk about the elephant in the room, which is the fact that our world is warming. This appears to be based on a whole bunch of science. It's not open for debate. It's happening because of the things that we are doing and what we've been doing over the last 150, 175 years. And it's unfortunately accelerating. It's become, frankly, everyone's problem, a challenge that we all face. And so the conversation we're hoping to have with you, and you're going to learn a little bit from Melissa, is how can we be a force for good, given the nature of the work that we do, even if our own organizations may not believe, based on the website or the About Us page, that you're a climate organization. I think the fact is we all are, whether we like it or not. So with that, let me hand it off to Melissa, and we'll see you all on the other side. Worth just flagging for everybody. For questions, we'll try to make a little time here at the end, but we will have office hours. Melissa has been kind enough, not only does she teach down at Rutgers, but she knows a little bit about this. She's carved out an extra 30 minutes for us on the other end of this hour where we can go a little bit deeper and you can actually talk to her directly. And so we usually gather a nice group of folks to sort of go a little bit deeper. So if you have time, happy to see you over there. All right, let me shut up. Melissa, over to you, my friend. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sean, and thanks to the Communications Network for inviting me to be with you here today. So welcome, everyone. My name is Melissa Aronczyk. I'm a professor at Rutgers University, as Sean mentioned, in the School of Communication and Information. And I'm with you all today to talk about how we talk about climate change. I just want to start by throwing out the name of a movie, which some of you may have seen. It's called Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. I don't know how many of you have seen it. What's funny is that I actually have not seen it. I mostly just watch TV with my son, who's 12, and I've been told that movie's not really for 12-year-olds. But I love the title because it actually describes how I've come to think about climate change. I've realized over the years that the best way for me to think about how to communicate about climate change is to see it as an everything, everywhere, all at once situation. Because no matter what our job title is, no matter what our role in our professional lives, we are actually all climate communicators. Because we live in a world that demands that we put climate change at the center of everything we do. So that's what I'm going to talk about over the next 35 to 40 minutes or so, is how we can bring climate change to the center to guide our communication. So let me just give you a bit of a roadmap for what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to start by just talking a little bit about myself and how I came to this work, how I came to the research that I do. Then I'm going to introduce what I call communication realities. These are baseline platforms from which we all communicate about the issues that our audiences care about. So I'll talk about 3 communication realities. And I'm then going to make 3 communication proposals or portraits for framing how we might talk about climate change. Then I'll give some practical suggestions and some inspirations in my conclusion. And finally, we'll have this discussion and Q&A. And as Sean mentioned, I'll stick around afterward for office hours. All right, so let's get started. When I was preparing to talk with you all today, I had several moments of hesitation about how forceful to be in my comments to you. I asked myself what kind of tone to set for a conversation about how we communicate in a warming world. It's a topic I'm very passionate about, I feel very strongly about, and I feel a real sense of urgency to act, and I want to convey this. But I also thought about what kind of an issue climate change is. And I realized, this is a problem unlike any other problem that any of us has ever faced. And so in that sense, it's not surprising if we don't feel like we know how to talk about it. Climate change needs communications tools that we don't already have in our toolkit. We need to develop new tools, and that's what I'm here to talk about today. So by way of introduction, I'm a professor in the School of Communication and Information at Rutgers, as I mentioned a moment ago. I've been there for about 10 years now. And I write and teach about what I call the promotional industries. That is the industries of branding, advertising, marketing, PR, lobbying. And I've written or edited 3 books on this topic. But my first 2 books were not about climate change at all. They were really focused on branding. Since I was a child, really for so many decades now, I have been fascinated by the magic of branding. How does it exert such a hold on people? How do brands create such devotion and loyalty among their audiences? No matter what the product is, whether it's shoes, soap, or countries, as I discovered in my second book. It really wasn't until I wrote my third book that I started thinking about how branding works when it comes to really complicated issues like climate change. I wanted to understand in this book how companies promote sustainability, but especially those companies whose products really don't have very much to do with sustainability. I'm thinking about companies in heavily polluting sectors like oil, gas, automobiles, chemical products, tobacco. How do these companies produce promotional campaigns about sustainability, and what effect do these campaigns have on their audience? So in this book, my co-author Maria Espinosa and I were really interested in what effect sustainability or climate-focused campaigns have on the whole universe of sustainability communication. Now, that book is what has brought me into wider and wider circles of communication, especially on what effective communication about climate change could look like. So let's turn to that question. I'm going to talk now about these 3 communication realities I mentioned a moment ago. So what do I mean when I say communication realities? I mean to point out what might be an obvious, but often is an overlooked fact. We are all living and working on a planet that is going through unprecedented change. This is a baseline reality for our communications in every context. And that has some pretty major implications, I think, for how we do our job as communicators. So let me talk now about the first communication reality that follows from that premise. Climate change affects everything. All problems are now climate-related problems. Climate change is here, and it's directly affecting every aspect of our lives. It's at the heart of international issues. It's at the heart of local issues. It's tied to big questions of justice and equality, and it's tied to small issues of individual decision-making. Climate change really gets us where we live. It confronts us in our daily lives and in the choices that we make. And in speaking with Sean Gibbons over the last couple of months to get ready for this talk, I came to recognize what an important group of people you all are, the people who are here in the audience today. I realized that you and your organizations are an essential link for many people, maybe even the only link between the daily realities of climate change and the things we care about in our everyday lives. And because you are change educators, because you are solutions-focused professionals, and because you want to empower your audiences and your communities to take care of their health and connect their health to the choices they make in their lives, you are all climate communicators now. Last week, I had a real privilege, and that was to speak to some park rangers at the National Park Service out in California. And, they quite literally have a mandate to talk about climate change during their guided tours of the parks. Now, the National Park System is a member of the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. This is a global network of sites, you might be familiar with this, that allow us to interpret history through place. And in that talk last week, we talked about how park rangers are really the voice for the site of conscience that is the natural world, that is the scenic beauty of the United States that their visitors have come expressly to discover. And that phrase, sight of conscience, really stayed with me because I think we too are relied upon in our communities to be the voice for all the sights of conscience that touch on your work. We also seek to promote justice and universal cultures of human rights when we communicate for good. And so we too have a mandate to connect people to the climate reality. So really related to that, let me talk now about the second communication reality I have in mind, which is that everyone needs to talk about climate change. The major commitment for us as communicators is to normalize conversations around climate change and to help our communities make sense of climate change in their lived experience. Climate change has real consequences for people, and I actually think people want to know how to connect their lives to climate change. They want to take control over the consequences, but they need a language with which to do this, and that's where you come in. We want to establish a relationship between what people are experiencing in their lives and the ways that this matters in society. Okay, so I've talked about the reality that climate change affects everything, and I've talked about the reality that we need to talk about it. So now we have a third communications reality, and this one is really going to hit us in the face, which is that climate change is really hard to talk about. So, it's all well and good for me to say, yes, we need to empower our communities, we need to talk about climate change. How do we get there? Climate change is what scientists and policy analysts have called a wicked problem, which means a social problem that is very hard to translate into policy or into practice because it's very, very hard to define what the problem even is. The legal scholar Richard Lazarus has gone even further and called climate change a super wicked problem. And he means to refer to three even more complex features about climate change. So he says the first feature that makes climate change so hard to define and act on is the fact that the longer it takes to address the problem, the harder it is to do so. That's a problem for us, is that it's something that demands action now, and yet we are always sort of caught up in this questioning or morass of how to figure out what it is. The second feature Richard Lazarus talks about that makes climate change so hard for us is that those who are in the best position to address climate change often are not only those who caused it, but are also those with the least immediate incentive to act upon it. So that too causes some real issues for us, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. The third feature Richard Lazarus speaks of is the fact that climate change is clearly a global problem, a planetary problem, but we don't have very good global lawmaking institutions that have the kind of reach and legal authority that match the scope of the problem. So those are the three features that make climate change a super wicked problem. And of course, beyond just the policy dimensions, the legal dimensions, climate change is not just rational, it's an emotional issue. So even beyond these concerns about, how do we set good policy, how do we make rules or set standards around climate change, the scale and the scope of climate change can provoke anxiety, fear, and denial in all of us. It's a very overwhelming idea. And fear can lead to apathy, it can lead to inaction, or it can lead to resistance. You might have heard about or seen this conversation that's referenced here in this New York Times headline. In 2019, the Oxford Dictionaries named climate emergency its word of the year. And a number of news organizations, including the New York Times and The Guardian in the UK, adopted this phrase, climate emergency, in their news coverage of climate change. But there are some recent studies, academic studies by people like my department colleague at Rutgers, Lauren Feldman, fantastic researcher, and her co-authors, who have shown that using terms like climate emergency in news stories can actually decrease people's sense of hope, and it can decrease their trust in the news source. And that can affect our own ability to talk about climate change, because we don't want to give people a sense of desperation. We don't want them to leave a conversation with us feeling despondent. And related to this, we have to take into account two more things that I think are really critical here. One is the media environment in which we find ourselves, and the other is the political environment. Different people have very different views on climate change, and climate change is not fundamentally a political issue, but of course it has become a deeply politicized conversation here in the US. And our media, especially social media, thrives on polarization and on politicization. We are communicating when we are online, especially in a very emotional space where strong opinions, quick takes, and even outrage circulate a lot faster and reach a lot more people more quickly than straightforward commentary, information-rich messaging, or complex ideas. So I've come to think, sort of drawing on my earlier research and this stuff, that climate change has a branding problem. And here's where I want to take us forward. I want to suggest that we flip the script on climate change. Can you use your expertise as interpreters, as educators, to talk about climate change in a way that allows your audience to understand its magnitude and its urgency, but also make us feel like we can all come together to face it? So now let me turn to these three communication proposals that I have in mind to try to address this question. My first suggestion is that we develop a climate imaginary. Now, I don't mean imaginary here like myths or fairy tales, although I could imagine how those could be fun and maybe useful. And I'm not referring, when I say imaginary, to just what happens in our own minds. I mean that because climate change is so unlike anything we've ever experienced before, we need a new image of what it is and how we can relate to it. I showed you these images earlier at the beginning of my presentation, and I'm going to guess you didn't feel very good when you saw these images. But when you search climate change in Google, these are the first images that pop up. Our current social climate imaginary is stuck in this, what you're seeing right now. How can we rethink the relationship between climate change and your communities? And how can you position yourselves and your organization as a guide to this rethinking? Now, I am a big fan of the philosopher Bruno Latour, who sadly passed away last year. But he spent most of his latter years focusing on this very question of a climate imaginary. And he believed that we have reached a moment where a completely new image of the Earth is needed. We need a new vantage point from which to see the planet and our relationship to it. No longer can we imagine nature as out there or ourselves as separate from this nature. Climate change can't be something we visit once a year when we go to a nature preserve. We need an imagination of society that includes our natural resources and the planet. Now, I think we already know as communications experts that audiences are much more receptive to information when it's framed inside the things they already know and care about. Because climate change affects everything, this lets us develop so many ways to reach out to our audiences. We can actually use so many different kinds of evidence to support our stories. And each story is cumulative. No matter how local or personal or big or universal, each story collects or amasses together to describe the conditions that we're living in. And this means for us thinking about what kinds of climate messaging and imaging will most impact or speak to your audience. For some of you, numbers are going to be your language. Some people want the statistics, they want the facts, they want the charts, the graphs, the figures, temperatures, number of species, etc. But for some of you, stories will be your allies in this endeavor. A climate imaginary shifts us from facts to concerns. That's an idea of Latour's, and I want to explain what I mean by that. What Latour meant is encapsulated in the quote you see here on the screen. When he says to have common facts, you need a common reality, he doesn't mean abandon the facts. Obviously, the facts really, really matter. The science matters. What he means is that facts look different to different people. Some respond to numbers, some respond to stories, and you can develop narratives that fit within the mission and values of your organization that connect to people, and those will be your facts. This leads me right into the second communications proposal that I want to make today. And that proposal is for you to model actions, but not necessarily solutions. Why do I say this? Climate change is not coming in the future, it's here. And one way to communicate that to our audiences is to talk about how we live with climate change. Climate change is a default baseline condition of our current existence. So we want to speak to our audiences with that condition always in mind. And despite some of the things I said earlier in my presentation, I do try to avoid talking about climate change as a problem when I'm speaking with communities about effective climate communication. And that's for a few reasons. One is related to something I said earlier. Climate change is complex. It carries many different interlocking parts. When we characterize climate change as a problem, we tend, as responsible humans, and especially you all as solutions-focused people, we tend to come up with solutions to the problem. But just as there is no one way to describe climate change, there is no one way to offer a solution. When we frame climate change as a problem, we are inviting disagreement and debate over what precisely the problem is. And we invite disagreement and debate over what the solution is. And that is actually a pretty good characterization of what we see in our public media and in our politics around climate change right now. So as interpreters, as educators, your role, to my mind, is about helping your communities to discover the meaning of climate change for themselves. And by discovering the meaning, what I mean is collecting climate realities to one's own beliefs and values so that they can incorporate the reality into their own worldview and learn how to take action in a way that implicates them. The geographer Mike Hulme, some of you may have heard of him, he's written several books about climate change and communication that are fantastic. And he makes this point in a really interesting way. He says, rather than asking, how do we solve climate change? We need to turn the question around and ask, how does the idea of climate change alter the way we arrive at and achieve our personal aspirations and our collective social goals? So the actions we are encouraging people to take are personal actions that they believe in. They are about their aspirations and about making those collective aspirations. So bringing what they have and what they know out into the community. Now, this idea of collective goals brings me to my third and final communication proposal, which is to promote shared resolve. I said earlier that we find ourselves currently in a fairly polarized environment here in the US, as we know, and that environment tends to make us feel like we don't share a lot of the same values and beliefs as a society. One effect of this lack of a shared or common world is that people get suspicious of facts. They're suspicious because they feel like facts are not really facts. They're attempts to tell us what to do or how to live. So one of the challenges we have when we're interpreting climate change for people is to show them that we are all together in this reality. We are all together experiencing the beauty of what we have around us, and we are all together learning about its fragility. And what we can do together is resolve to protect that experience. I want to just pause here for a second and remind myself and just say here that this is hard. I want to acknowledge that. We are talking about asking our audiences, our communities, to imagine the togetherness of the entire world's population and what we are all facing. So it's hard. I just want to put that out there. I think a lot of people worry that what we are facing is having less than we had before. Less air, less water, less usable land, or maybe that they'll be deprived of their livelihoods or their lifestyles. And those narratives of scarcity and deprivation are genuinely scary. They can ignite a sense of denial out of fear. One way we can think about reframing that scarcity narrative is to think about restoring balance. When we decide together to restore balance to the earth, we are not having less, we're hurting less. We can still have abundance by bringing back what's naturally abundant. And that's, some of you may be already familiar with that distinction between narratives of scarcity and abundance. I guess the glass half empty, half full is the classic symbol of that. But I think it has a particular meaning, or maybe takes on a renewed meaning in the context of climate change, because we are literally talking about the abundance of our natural resources versus the scarcity that people feel like they're being asked to contend with. A lot of climate communicators, and maybe many of you here, have adopted the frame of resilience. And I thought about that a little bit between this distinction between resilience and resolve. And I came on the side of resolve. I think I like resolve better. For me, when I hear resilience, I kind of think of hunkering down and waiting for a miracle. For me, resolve thinking is about action. It's about keeping calm and carrying on. It's about courage, and it's about collective effort. I think it's important, just one more frame for us to maybe play with. I think it's important to think of climate change as both a short-term and a long-term perspective. From a short-term one, just to bring in the wonderful climate scientist and communicator, Katharine Hayhoe, she, a couple of years ago, said that the bottom line is that to care about climate change, we only have to be one thing, and that's a human living on this planet, and we're all that. So the short-term perspective on climate change can be to use your voice of conscience to show us how to care about climate change. It is your mandate as powerful, influential connectors in your communities to allow people to be human in their own ways in the context of climate change. From a long-term perspective, the way I think about this is we're not solving a problem now or even for the next generation. We are adapting to a new reality, to a permanent state change. And that is something that every generation has had to do over time in their own context. In the public good, in the shared interest, we have resolved over the generations to get through times of threat, times of extreme challenge. And in our time, the resolve is to adapt to the reality of climate change. So I want to conclude now by talking about inspirations or takeaways or things you can put into play. I really like the word inspiration because these are things that I myself am encountering right now and using to inspire my own work. So this book by Rachel Carson, Lost Woods, I imagine that many of you are quite familiar, if not in its content, at least in the name of her book, Silent Spring, from the early 1960s. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was widely considered to have launched the environmental movement in the United States. And there are several reasons why this is so, and I've written extensively about that. But one of the reasons that I hold on to with that book and with all of her writing is that her writing is so compelling. It's so beautiful. It's so enduring. Rachel Carson's writing is, to my mind, why that book has stayed with us and why it had the impact that it had. She was a communicator. She changed how we view the living world and the future of human life on Earth. So I'm recommending this book to you because it might be less familiar than Silent Spring, and also because this book is a collection of essays, speeches, and some of her more informal writings about nature. So I find that very inspiring for me to think about in some of the more interesting talks I'm giving, like this one here, and in my writing as well. A second inspiration that I have also comes from Bruno Latour, and I don't know if you can see this image too clearly. It's quite hazy, and that's actually by design. This is a screenshot of a performance that Bruno Latour gave a few years ago. I think it was 2017, called Inside, and this is a screenshot from the performance, which is on YouTube, and again, highly recommended. And so this is obviously an image of the Earth, and if you peer down at the bottom there, you'll see Latour himself, who was at the podium speaking, and he had that image projected behind him. This performance, called Inside, is billed as Latour's anti-TED Talk. It's a presentation by Dr. Latour of climate imaginaries, of alternative visualizations of the planet as ways to think and talk about climate change. So I really, really enjoy this. I find this very thought-provoking and creative. One last suggestion that I have, one last inspiration, is a fantastic book called I'm Right and You're an Idiot. I wish I myself had come up with that title. And it's by James Haugen. James Haugen is a Canadian public relations expert and also a climate advocate who spent many years for this book interviewing some of the most thoughtful speakers and writers about how to communicate in constructive and open-minded ways. So this book is not specifically about climate change. It's about a range of challenging or contentious issues in society that a variety of different people have tried to apprehend and tried to develop healthy dialogue around. So James Haugen interviews religious figures and linguists and psychologists to understand what open dialogue can look like about all kinds of polarizing social issues and how to overcome it. So that closes things for me. I'm just going to end quickly by saying that part 2 of this will be coming up in May. I'm going to continue this conversation with more insights about communications framing and strategy. But now I think we're at the Q&A. Thanks, everyone.
We are. And you know what we're going to do, Melissa, because we have a little bit of time. Gang, we're going to stay here, and I'm going to invite you. A number of you have already done so. Go into the QA box. It actually says the words Q&A. You can ask your question. You can also vote for questions. So let's go ahead and do that. Melissa, the first one that came in was from our friend Alec, and he asks, when you are dealing with groups or actors that are clearly malicious or manipulative in their viewpoint, how do you reconcile their messaging with the goals you state here of inclusivity?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's obviously a very revealing question, because it does point to the fact that we are communicating in a contentious space. So, I mean, because I'm an academic researcher, and in fact, that answering that question is the goal of much of my research, of course, I'm thinking in 15 different directions about what kinds of malicious actors or what kinds of things they're saying. clearly the strategies that have been adopted by, let's say, by climate advocates right now on social media, and the kinds of responses we've had, where it's, my facts versus your facts, right? My truth versus your lies. As we've seen in not just in the social media environment we have, but in media environments, in public opinion environments in general, we see that those conversations end up being kind of a race to the bottom. Because, as many people have pointed out, you're never going to convince people who come to the table with an opposing view. Everyone is trying to convince each other of their view. So one thing that I think about a lot, rather than thinking about truth and lies, or, I'm right and you're wrong, is how to think about legitimacy. What does it mean to be considered as a legitimate actor when we are speaking about issues? If I take the case of Rachel Carson, that's actually a very interesting case study, and I won't go on too long because I know there are other questions, but just briefly, Rachel Carson was not just a beautiful writer. She was a not just a beautiful and compelling writer. She was a federal employee with the Department of Fish and Wildlife. She was a naturalist. She was a biologist. She was a science writer. And she had really done her homework for Silent Spring. She really knew what she was talking about. And there was a massive counter campaign actually attempting to discredit Rachel Carson in the 60s when that book came out. But a counter campaign against that kind of legitimate viewpoint was impossible to dislodge. And in fact, what it ended up doing in that case was to make the counter campaigners look even worse. It made them look as though they were clearly trying to hide what Rachel Carson was saying. And this question of legitimacy, I think, is a really important one for us to keep in mind, because it addresses the relativism of the conversation. It means that we are all in it together. It's not me speaking and then you speaking and they're cross purposes. It's how do we think about the space we're in and develop legitimacy?
I think that's a good segue. Just given the roles that many folks are coming with into this conversation today, we know foundations and nonprofits, at a time when our society where not much is held in high regard or high esteem, foundations and nonprofits are still highly regarded. And there's a bunch of research out there that says that that's true, which means that we all have a special privilege and a place of influence and presumably legitimacy, which leads to the next question, which a number of you want to hear the answer to, which is, can you give more examples of modeling actions versus discussing solutions? What do you mean by that? If you map that out
Yes.
a little bit better.
Sure. So, when I first started thinking about why do I take issue with the idea of solutions, I was really thinking about some of the current climate governance principles, whereby we see a lot of companies, especially technology companies and others in that space, in that sector, coming forward and saying, we've developed, this innovative platform to solve problems of climate change. If everybody just jumps on this tech platform, then we'll have a new mechanism. Or we've developed this benchmarking and everyone is going to jump into this benchmarking system. And I think a few things happen. Well, one thing I'll say, just to be clear and to kind of give a balanced answer, is that I'm not against those types of things at all. In fact, I think they are contributing to the common good, or they at least are working with the right intention of moving towards the common good. And as I said earlier, with stories, these things are cumulative. It means that we are thinking and taking action around climate change when we have those initiatives. So I'm not against them in the least. But what they sometimes do is they alleviate the responsibility of others. They say, I got this. And it does make people then feel like, oh, they got this, so I don't need to do anything. They're solving it. They've got it taken care of. But sometimes what I see happening is when these benchmarking or tech platforms or others come into the space, they're designed to solve a very specific problem that they themselves have defined. So, if I'm a tech platform and I say the problem is we need more mapping, we need more visualization of climate disasters. And then they develop a tech platform to solve that specific problem. But that has not solved climate change by any dimension. Nobody would say that it had. But the frame of solutionism, I think, can lead to people just kind of falling off. the other reason, as I said earlier, is that I think solutions discussion always then creates an environment where people say, well, but that's not the solution. That's not the problem. That's not the solution. So then what ends up happening is now we're in a debate over what the problem is and what the solution is, and we're not actually moving forward. So for me, action orienting rather than solution orienting is, it speaks to a more cumulative and collective framework than does the language of solutions.
So it's a spirit of join us rather than we got this.
Exactly.
Next question comes from our friend Steven, and he asks, I'm curious about your take on the phrase X problem is unsustainable. And he writes, it's used with so many intractable problems like climate change, healthcare costs, the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, police violence, that these trends are unsustainable. And yet the status quo persists because it's very hard to disrupt. Something is sustainable until it's not. It's amazing how humans limp along without taking action. So what's the way to de-emphasize the idea of unsustainable?
Wow.
That's a mouthful, I know.
Yeah, that's it. No, I mean, this is real food for thought. Sustainability is such an interesting metaphor, right? Or label, like, what do we really mean when we say sustainability? I'm most familiar when I hear the word sustainability with the evolution of environmental management in the United States, more so than with some of the other examples that the question contained. And sustainability was meant to be about resource management. But what ended up happening was, well, a few things happened. It could be a very long story, and my book does a better job covering this than I will in this answer period. But essentially, what it ended up meaning was sustaining the status quo. Sustainability ended up being a sort of bridge to nowhere, because it really got taken out of its origins as, providing for the present, but also providing for the future. I think that was the initial conception of that term. And it got put into a category of persisting with the way things are. And that seems to be what you're alluding to in your question. So I think we've really, it's almost like we've redefined the term, and then the term has become somewhat emptied of its meaning. And unfortunately, I was kind of alluding to this actually in my talk, when everything's sustainable, nothing is, right? Or when nothing's sustainable, it doesn't really have the kind of traction that it needs to have. And when that happens, it affects the genuinely environmentally sustainable initiatives that are taking place, because the word has been drained of its meaning, or the concept has been drained of its meaning, if that makes sense. So it's like everything, the whole thing moves down and has less traction.
Okay, just a reminder, everybody, I'm pulling these questions from the QA box, and you can add your own or you can vote for them. So the next one that has 9 votes for it comes from an anonymous attendee who says, according to the Yale program on climate change communication, more than half American adults are already alarmed or concerned about climate change, and that share has been steadily growing. Organizations I work with, this is the questioner, don't struggle with changing hearts or mind. Many don't even try to speak to deniers. Instead, the challenge seems to be convincing those who are already concerned or alarmed to take meaningful action. So the question is, I'm curious if you have any strategies or frames for communicating climate change to folks who are already, quote unquote, on board, but perhaps need a nudge to take action.
Yes, I mean, I feel like this is really at the heart of what we are trying to do, is those who are already sharing the values and beliefs that we want to convey, but looking for answers, looking for ways to live in this climate reality. Gosh, where do I begin? One thing that has really struck me when I was chatting with Sean before this presentation, we ended up having a chat about what types of things have made people sit up and take notice. So we talked about the film like Don't Look Up, for instance, entertainment media. And again, to refer again to my colleague, Dr. Lauren Feldman at Rutgers, she has done a lot of research on the power of entertainment media to inform us about climate change. So not everyone liked that film, didn't work for everyone. But for, say my 12-year-old son, who's now watched that film with me 3 times, it transformed him. It really was transformative. It made him feel like he knew and could sort of peek behind the curtain of the manipulations that were taking place and wouldn't let himself now be bothered by those manipulations. Or in fact, now he even enjoys those manipulations. When a commercial comes on TV now, he says, oh, look what they're trying to sell us. They're trying to show us that that car is good for the environment by driving it up a hill, but we all know that that's a gas guzzling, carbon dioxide emitting car. So he that film for him empowered him to take action by noticing it, by acclimating himself quite literally to climate change in his reality. And he tells everyone who will listen now about that film and about what he knows. So to me, that's action. That's a way to channel fear or just that sense of overwhelm that so many people have around climate change to direct action where it's part of his life now. And, I could go on about how I won't let him buy plastic bottles at the supermarket. He just wants to kill me. I'm so on top of him. But, me being on top of him, he's my 12-year-old. He's got it in him now, and he's taking action about it, and he feels like he can make change in his communities. So I hope that example has sparked some inspiration for some of you.
Speaking of kiddos, next question comes in from our friend Emily, and she asks, I am a sustainability coordinator at a school district working through Green Iowa AmeriCorps. I want to know how you recommend talking to kids about climate change without implying that their future will be scary. Oh boy, every parent has this question.
Yes, every parent does. And I liken it sometimes to also the issues we have as parents with our kids and social media. The same, it feels sort of terrifying, and yet it's everywhere. And, you're like trying to put your finger in the dike and then the water comes out from somewhere else. So I can really relate to that question as a parent. And as someone who works with young people, though not as young as the ones you're working with. The film I mentioned a moment ago is, as I said, it's not for everyone. So I'm certainly not going to proselytize about that film in particular. But I think kids feeling like they know and they can do, I'm sure that's actually probably already part of your curriculum, that kids can take on these issues. Many of us, of course, are familiar with Greta Thunberg and the way she has inspired some, but again, she's not for everyone. So rather than centering on one thing, like one movie, one important figure or political figure, or one, facts and information page, I want to encourage our young people to devise ways of making the normal not normal. So I'll refer back to my example of plastic bottles. One of the things so with my son, I personally am very obsessed with not using single-use plastic. It's just a thing for me right now. And I feel like for me, it is the one little thing that I can do on a daily basis is choose not to buy a bottle of whatever. So when I take my kid anywhere and he wants a plastic bottle of something, the answer is always no. And where's your own water bottle if you're so thirsty, or we'll be home in an hour. Can it wait? And I've done it so often now, and I always tease him about plastic. You want to buy that? It's just plastic garbage. It's just going to be plastic garbage. When we go into a store now he starts saying things like, why are there so many plastic bottles in the store? Like, why couldn't they, don't you think those companies are smart enough to come up with another material for their bottles? I mean, come on, but he starts. So it's so normal for us everywhere we go. There are plastic bottles everywhere, literally everywhere. But he is starting to make that everywhereness and that normalcy not normal. And I feel like kids they're so observant. They're so aware of that. And things to them everything is kind of interesting and not just taken for granted and normal. They ask those questions. So channeling those questions into letting them point out that those things aren't normal, have that sense of power in knowing that's not normal, and then pointing it out to other people and making choices on that basis. That would be one way I'd try to go about it.
Let's make this the last question, then we'll go into office hours for those who wish to join us, and we'll put something into the chat. So you're going to have to, if you're in the Q&A, tether over to the chat, and I believe Kareem or Tristan has put in a link where we can actually see one another and chit chat. The last question, again, comes from an anonymous attendee, but question is, the shared resolve, quote unquote, shared resolve frame had such great promise in communicating about the pandemic and getting people on board to work together and protect one another. And it was subsumed by polarization. What might we learn from that as we use the same frame to communicate about climate change?
I'm sorry, can you ask that one more time? I'm
I
not
sure
sure.
can. I did it
Yeah,
really
sorry about
fast.
that.
So the
Right.
shared resolve frame had such great promise during the pandemic, getting people to get on board to work together and protect one another, stay home, mask up, all those directives. But ultimately, this person's point of view is it was subsumed by polarization. What might we learn from the polarization that occurred around that shared resolve frame that we can use to communicate about climate change? What can we learn from what happened from the pandemic?
Oh, that's an amazing question, because it's so, yeah, it really helps us connect to some of the frustration that so many people had, I think, during the pandemic, and wondering what the best way was to communicate about it, because it was, by some measures, really a communication problem gone wrong so much of the time. That said, I think there are some really important distinctions between the pandemic and climate change that I want to draw, because I think maybe it'll help us figure out what lessons to take from it. So COVID was an extreme unknown that was, known by increments, known in different ways. And of course, the question of legitimacy came up, who is the knower and when do we know and how do we act and so on. So it was unprecedented, like climate change is unprecedented. But with climate change, we have at least 30, if not 50 years of climate science behind what climate change is. We don't have it's not the same types of unknowns. The future is still, there's a lot of open questions. But what to do and how to do it, we actually have a lot of that in place. Of course, we also have this polarization around the science, around facts, around government regulation and policy and so on. So I won't downplay that. But the second thing is that with COVID, I think we always thought that it was temporary. We always wanted it to be over. And so we saw an end. And so then we had a lot of debates about what the end would look like, or when the end would come. Or, how serious is it really? In this case, it's a new reality. It's not, and I want to be careful, because I understand we are many people, and how do I put this? People say we are post-COVID, but of course we are all also learning to live with a variety of new kinds of diseases and so on. So I don't want to either downplay that reality. And at the same time, I think of climate change as a condition in which we need to live that can incorporate some of the conversations about diseases, about vaccines, about health, but that also comes with the potential for optimism and the potential for action in a variety of different ways, according to a variety of different kinds of organizations and what they're equipped to do.